Good evening, everyone. My name is David Koss with the U of M Club of DC. Take me back to Tulsa to the scene of the crime. That is a Bob Dylan lyric from his nearly 20-minute song from last year, Murder Most Foul. And the line appears early in the groundbreaking An American City and Its Search for Justice, the eminently readable new book from Dutton by Tulsa native and U of M scholar Scott Ellsworth, who is with us this evening to discuss the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 on the 100th anniversary of the tragedy. Scott, whose book Death in a Promised Land was the first ever comprehensive history of the massacre, is with Michigan's Department of Afroamerican and African Studies. Scott will be in conversation with a longtime friend of the DC Club, Professor Vincent Hutchings, the Haynes Walton Jr. Collegiate Professor of Political Science at Michigan. Professor Hutchings is also with U of M's Department of Afroamerican and African Studies and its Institute for Social Research. As a reminder, this event is being recorded. The recording will be available on UMDC's YouTube channel in a few weeks. Please use the Q&A feature to pose questions and make any comments. Professor Hutchings.
Thank you, David. First, let me just say I'm very happy to be here for this event. It's obviously very important and timely in light of what's been going on in the country over the last year or two or more, I suppose. So thank you, Scott, for obviously being here as well. You're kind of the star of the show. I've got a number of questions here that I want to begin with. But I also want to keep the conversation informal and let it flow wherever things happen to flow. The first thing I'd like to start with, if you don't mind, is by asking you, for purposes of our audience who may only be dimly aware of the details of the massacre, if you could explain briefly the events that sparked the massacre, the 1921 Tulsa massacre, some of the basic facts about the event, and the status of the investigation, because of course there are investigatory elements that are still ongoing even today. So I'll summarize that more adroitly, hopefully. What sparked the violence? Approximately how many people were injured or even killed, at least according to the current accounts? And what is the current status of the search for victims reportedly buried in mass graves?
Absolutely. No, I'm happy to do so. First of all, let me just tell you all, I'm really thrilled to be with the U of M Club in Washington. I lived in DC for 15 years. I got married there. I had my first professional job there. I worked for 10 years on the Mall at the National Museum of American History. So I've got lots of fond memories. And I can tell you, in fact, that the first book I wrote about the massacre, Death in a Promised Land, I was living in a studio apartment at 15th and Rhode Island. The rent was $159 a month. And I just had my old manual Smith Corona college typewriter, but I was doing work for a think tank on DuPont Circle, and they had IBM Selectric electric typewriters. So I would sneak in at night and go ahead and bang out the new book. But anyway, so I'm really grateful to be with you all. So I think, I'll try to be succinct with this. I think it's first of all important to get us back into the mindset of what's going on in America in the years right after World War I. And this is a particularly ugly period of American race relations. It's also a particularly perilous time for African Americans. Lynchings are, of course, still going on. The numbers have started to decline, but the barbarity has increased. The United States was a nation in the first decades of the 20th century where human beings were burned at the stake. This is an era of the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan in 1915, but the Klan was no longer a Southern organization, it was a national organization. The Klan ran the state governments in New Jersey, Indiana, Oregon, eventually Oklahoma as well too. And this is also an era where you had these incidents of racial violence, and everybody called them race riots in those days. Black newspapers did, white newspapers did, the NAACP, you name it. But everyone understood what they were. And there would be some sort of a racial incident involving blacks and whites that then blossomed into white people attacking African Americans in downtown areas, white mobs invading Black communities, looting, burning, and killing. And Jim Crow is on the rise in the North. There's a lot going on. And in the African American community, particularly amongst World War I veterans who had gone to fight in France, there was very much a sense of militant self-defense. There's all this militant white racism. So we're going to meet fire with fire. When the murderers come, we're prepared. So that's the overall, winds blowing through the country, and Tulsa's part of that. Now, Tulsa was a very unique city. In the year 1900, Oklahoma wasn't a state yet for 7 years, but Tulsa was a very dusty, Creek Indian and cowboy town, less than 1,000 people, no paved streets. It looked like a little Western movie town. By 1920, there were 100,000 people living in Tulsa. There were 20-story skyscrapers, electric streetcars, mansions, movie theaters, you name it. And the reason was oil. And the richest small oil field in the world was discovered right outside of Tulsa in 1905. And Tulsa caught the oil boom, and it was known as the Magic City, because now you don't see it, now you do. And the city was awash in oil and oil money. And while African Americans were barred from working in the oil industry, there were African Americans where all of that oil money started to wash into the community. So Blacks made up 10% of the population of the city, lived in sort of a pie-shaped neighborhood known as Greenwood. And the neighborhood prospered, and it prospered. It's very famous now. People now call Black Wall Street. It wasn't called that in the 1920s. It was known as Greenwood. And you had a handful of African-American families who really did quite well. The Williams family, John and Lula and their son, Bill, they owned the Dreamland Theater, which sat 700 people. They owned an automobile garage. They were the first African-Americans in Tulsa to have their own car. They owned a 3-story Williams building that had a confectionery on the first floor. On the third floor, they rented it out to offices to some of Tulsa's more than a dozen African-American doctors and lawyers. The family had their apartments on the second floor. And there were other families, a handful of other families who did quite well as well. And then there was maybe 100 to 200 families of African-American merchants that had smaller businesses, maybe tailor shops, mom and pop, small restaurants, things like that, but their clientele was exclusively African-Americans. But what's driving the economy is the high employment of Black service workers, men and especially women. 80% of the adults work in the white community during the day as maids, as butlers, as dishwashers, as ditch diggers, whatnot. But there was so much money that they got a good salary, and they brought those paychecks at the end of the week and they spent it in Greenwood, and that allowed the community to develop. So and Greenwood was remarkable. There were 2 movie theaters. There were more than 30 restaurants. There were 30 grocery stores and meat markets. There were African-American owned photography studios, dry cleaners, dress shops, dressmaking shops. There were 2 Black schools, a Black post office, a Black library, a Black hospital, more than a dozen churches, all of this in this community. Now, most people were not millionaires. Most people lived in very plain wooden homes without indoor plumbing or electricity. But it's a community, they knew who they were, and they were thriving. It was a very active place, lots of, the book clubs and debate societies, missionary groups, all of that. Jazz music is getting invented. Greenwood is a part of all that. All right. But in Tulsa, you had this darkening of race relations. There was a lot of crime in the city, and there was a lot of anger about crime. In fact, no Tulsans could get automobile insurance because the amount of theft of cars was so high. And in 1920, the anger, particularly amongst whites against crime, showed itself when an 18-year-old white telephone company worker had murdered a white taxi cab driver, was arrested, taken to jail, and one evening during the saga, a lynch mob of whites shows up outside of the courthouse in whose jail this young man was held. The Tulsa police are nowhere to be found. Members of the mob who are armed go to the sheriff and they demand the prisoner. His name is Roy Belton. The prisoner turns him over to the white mob. The police then show up, and a caravan of cars 3 miles long, these are all white people involved, drive Belton out to where he had shot the taxi cab driver, and they lynch him on the spot. And what's more remarkable is in the days after that, the city fathers of Tulsa, also the newspapers, the sheriff, they all declared that this was a good event for the city because it showed the criminal element that the law-abiding citizens aren't going to put up with any more crime. And the only dissenting voice was from one of Tulsa's 2 Black newspapers, the Tulsa Star, who editorialized that, not only was the lynching of Roy Belton, which was the first lynching in Tulsa, wrong, but also that it exploded the theory that a prisoner was safe in the courthouse jail. So 1 year later, there's an incident in an elevator involving an African-American shoe shiner named Dick Rowland, age 19, and a white elevator operator, Sarah Page, age 17. We don't know what happened. We think that when Dick walked onto the elevator, that he tripped, he put out his hands to break his fall, that he caught Sarah on the shoulder. She screamed, he ran out of the elevator. The police were summoned, they show up, but they don't appear to be particularly worried about this. This was on Memorial Day, Monday, May 30th, 1921. They, talked to a couple people. There was, but it's not until the next morning that they go and arrest Dick Rowland at his house. They bring him in, and the wheels of justice, Jim Crow justice, are slowly turning. Sarah Page will refuse to press charges eventually, saying nothing happened. But a reporter for the Tulsa Tribune, which was the city's afternoon white daily newspaper, caught wind of this. And in the trailer's Bulldog, or first edition that afternoon, that came out at 3 o'clock, there was a front page story that was this fantastic write-up that said that Dick Rowland had clearly been stalking Sarah Page. He wouldn't give the police his name, that he sexually assaulted her, they tore her dress, scratched her face, all of this stuff. But there was also a now famous lost editorial in the Tribune titled "To Lynch Negro Tonight," which of course was reference to the lynching the year before. So the Tribune hits the streets at about 3:30. By 4 o'clock, there's lynch talk on the streets of Tulsa. Remember, there's no radio yet, there's no internet, there's not that many telephones. So word spreads, and this white mob gathers 100, 200, 300, 500, 800. But there's a new sheriff in town, and this sheriff is not about to turn over Dick Rowland. He's made that very clear. He's disabled the elevators in the courthouse. He's blockaded the stairs. He's put his deputies on the roof with high-powered rifles, and it's not happening. So you have this standoff going on. Meanwhile, word hits Greenwood that there's a young African-American in mortal danger. People gather on Greenwood Avenue in what is known as Deep Greenwood and the commercial district, trying to figure out their options, what to do. An African-American World War I vet who'd fought in France jumps on the stage of the Greenmount Theater and says, "Shut this place down. We ain't letting this happen in here." And people are gathered. And hardly anybody knew Dick Rowland. Let's point that out. He's just a racial brother. So at about 7 o'clock that evening, 25 Black World War I vets, most of whom have gone home to put on their now 2-year-old Army uniforms, all of whom were armed with rifles, pistols, and shotguns, climb into cars, drive in a caravan to the courthouse, get out of the cars, march single file, present themselves to the sheriff, and say, "We're here to help you defend the prisoner if you'd like us to." The sheriff says, "Get the hell out of here." They move, they go back in their cars, they go back to Greenwood. But their presence absolutely electrifies and enrages this white mob. So white mob members now call others to come to the courthouse. They go home to get their guns. A group of mob members goes over to the National Guard Armory to try to break in to get the Springfield rifles that are there. They're held off by National Guardsmen. But this pressure cooker is burning. All of these, cooking, frustration, whatnot going on. Finally, at about 10 o'clock, a rumor hits Greenwood that whites are now storming the courthouse. They weren't, but the rumor hits Greenwood. So this time, 75 African-American men, World War I vets, all armed, climb into cars, drive down, repeat the earlier visit, drive down to the courthouse, present themselves as sheriff. He sends them away. As they're leaving, an elderly white man goes up to a tall black vet and says, "Where are you going with that gun?" Vet says, "I'm going to use it if I have to." White man says, "Like hell you are. Give it to me." A struggle ensues. A shot goes off, and America's single worst incident of racial violence now begins. So briefly, you know, there's sort of a period of initial violence. There's gunfire at the courthouse. We don't know how many people die in that. The Tulsa police now show up, and this is a vastly majority white police force. A couple of black officers are nowhere near this area. Rather than disarm the white mob, try to send them home, instead they deputize members of the white mob. Police officers also start breaking into sporting goods stores and pawn shops to gain access to the rifles and pistols that are there. They then start handing those out to white mob members saying, "Get a gun and get an N-word." Meanwhile, there are murders of innocent African Americans downtown who are simply getting off work, at this time, as dishwashers, whatnot, shot down in the streets. There is an early, and the black vets meanwhile fight their way back to Greenwood, but there aren't a lot of street lights. It's dark. They're able to get there, largely in one piece from what we can tell. There are a couple early efforts to sort of attack during these nighttime hours. The edges of the black community, a couple fires are set, but those are put out because these are neighborhoods that also abut white businesses as well. There are some people murdered. Whites will get in cars and armed and make drive-by shootings down black residential neighborhoods, firing into living rooms and children's bedrooms and whatnot. And there is an early effort to invade Deep Greenwood, this commercial district, but it's repelled by black property owners. Whatever street lights are there are shot out, and they're able to keep these whites from crossing the tracks. So what happens is at about 2:00 in the morning, the city is now silent. This is now on June 1st. And there are some African Americans who have already started to leave town, by starlight going out to the country. Other people are unaware, and still others think, okay, we made it through, the problem is over, the sun's going to come up, everything is going to be fine. So there's a sense of relief. What African Americans in Tulsa didn't know is that whites were then organizing during these nighttime hours. We know about white men going into all-night cafes, speakeasies, saying we're all gathering at this corner and that corner to get ready. We know about certain intersections in the white community where whites would gather, hundreds of them. A guy will stand up on a foot of a car and say, okay, we're going to go in at dawn and we're going to attack the Greenwood, attack the black neighborhood. If you need arms, let us know. If you need ammunition, whatnot. So while black Tulsans are having relief in those early morning hours, white Tulsans are putting another pot of coffee on the stove and staying up. So what happens is shortly before dawn, there are thousands, and we don't know the number, whether it's 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 whites are in these different groups on the outskirts across railroad tracks from Greenwood. Bill Williams, who was a massacre survivor I first interviewed in 1975, was with his part of the Williams family, he helped defend all night long, the earlier attack. He said you could look out across the tracks and it looked like stars, and what you saw were the cigarettes and cigars glowing of all of the white mob. The sun comes up, some sort of a siren goes off. We still don't know what it was. We think it's like maybe a factory whistle. We're not sure, and that's the signal to move. And so this white mob gets up and starts moving towards Greenwood. Remember that whites outnumber blacks 10-1. And, there are lots of atrocities that happen, but basically it's fairly systematic what happens. Any African Americans who resist are killed, going block by block. Others are arrested, either by the police who are helping to do this, or just by members of the white mob. They're disarmed and they're taken to what are these internment centers that are created at the baseball park, the fairgrounds, other places where they are held under armed guard for several days. Whites then break into businesses and homes, they loot them, and then they set them on fire. And then we go block by block by block by block. African Americans fight back. Of course they do. There are very hot gunfights at different places. The white National Guard units, however, they get involved and they take the side of the white mob. They open up their machine guns on, on churches and other places where blacks are defending. And we go one after the other, one after the other. Meanwhile, the governor in Oklahoma City, which is 100 miles away, had been notified of the outbreak of violence. He mobilized state troops, National Guardsmen from outside, they're all white as well too, from Oklahoma City and whatnot. And it takes a while for them to get to the train station. It takes a while for them to finally come. We know that that in private hands, there was at least one machine gun in white hands that was taken from the American Legion post and taken to a grain elevator that overlooked Greenwood. It opened fire. We also know that airplanes were in the air as well too. There weren't many airplanes in Tulsa, a handful. Most of these are biplanes with, one or two, pilot, maybe a co-pilot passenger. They're open cockpit, canvas over wooden. They don't go very fast. There's been a lot of exaggeration about them, but I think that there is very solid evidence that at least one of the planes that people were dropping sticks of dynamite on Greenwood. That being said, and Greenwood was the first American city ever to be bombed, but that being said, Greenwood was destroyed on the ground, and it was destroyed. So by the time the state troops finally arrive late in the morning on June 1st and take control, martial law is declared, more than 1,000 African-American homes and businesses have been looted and burned to the ground. More than 35 square blocks of Greenwood, almost all of Greenwood, is now a wasteland that looks like Hiroshima or Nagasaki. 10,000 people, African-Americans, are now homeless. They're all also being held under armed guard in these camps. It'll take them several days to get back. And in the aftermath of the massacre, a number of things happen. The first is that no white person ever spends a day in jail for any of the murders, looting, or arson. A grand jury, an all-white grand jury, is impaneled. They end up blaming Black people and saying there was no spirit of a lynch mob. Nothing happened until these Black vets showed up. And that is in basic the story of the massacre itself. I've been studying how many people died for a long time now. The fact of the matter is that nobody knows. I think reasonable estimates, reasonable ones where there's data to back it up, goes from somewhere in the 70s to perhaps as high as 300, but we don't know if the number's 75 or 299. We simply don't know. And there's a lot of reasons for that, nor do we know the ratio of Black to white casualties. It's the term of the day now is to call this Tulsa Race Massacre. I can tell you that a number of African-American survivors that I interviewed in the 70s hated that term. And they said, we got as many of them as they got of us. I don't think that's true, but we don't know what that ratio is. I started the search for the unmarked graves in 1998 as part of the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, a state commission. During that, and had a lot of help and really expert help. We met with more than 300 Tulsans in between 98 and 2000, including undertakers, survivors, eyewitnesses, funeral home records, city employees, whatnot. We identified 3 areas in town where I still believe to this date that massacre victims are buried in unmarked graves. The state archaeologist was involved. We had some very primitive ground penetrating radar, inconclusive results. And then that first effort was shut down. We got caught up in the politics of reparations. And then 2 years ago in 2019, the now current mayor of Tulsa asked me and the state archaeologist to restart this investigation. We've identified a 4th site since then. We brought in ground radar and other things. And we have not been lucky yet. We've had 2 excavations. The first, we thought we were certain, or the archaeologists were certain we had found a mass grave. We had not. In a second excavation that we did, we found at least one victim and buried in a city-owned cemetery where there was supposed to be no one buried. At least one what we presume is a massacre victim, one person who had their gunshot wounds and bullets were there. But we still have a ways to go. We know without a doubt that at least 18 massacre victims were buried in this one city-owned cemetery, Oak Lawn Cemetery, identified and unidentified massacre victims, but we haven't, with the exception possibly of this first one, we haven't found that grave yet. We have other sites. So I've talked far too long now, Vincent.
No,
So I tried to be succinct, and we can circle back, but let me just stop now and get a glass of water.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Refresh yourself. But I wanted you to go on because it was just fascinating. I know the broad outlines of the story, but you were absolutely laying out details I had not heard before. And one question, and I had a series of them prepared for you, but one that came to mind as you were speaking involved your work with the commission. So again, just for the audience, the state of Oklahoma authorized a commission to study the massacre. We'll just use that language because that's how it's described, maybe appropriately these days. In the late 1990s, I think it was 93 or 92 or thereabouts, or somewhere in that time frame.
97.
97, okay.
Right.
So a commission was authorized. I understand you were either on the commission or I guess the historian attached to the commission. And as you lay out these details, Scott, I'm just curious, you obviously in your role conveyed these details to not just the members of the commission, but also to the state authorities, politicians, educators. How did they respond when you described these events to them? What kind of reaction did you get?
Well, I got to figure out how to jump in on this story. I'm gonna throw a slight curve, but I'll get to that point. So I think the one thing it's very important to remember is that the story of the massacre was actively suppressed for more than 50 years. So in the white community, official records disappeared, stolen, never to be seen again. Articles were cut out of newspapers. That famous Two Lynch Negro editorial was ripped out of the bound volumes of the Tulsa Tribune. Before those were microfilmed by the WPA in the 1930s. Early researchers as late as the 1970s were threatened with their lives for doing this. People would not write about it. That was that. The irony is that it wasn't, and Tulsa's white daily newspapers went to extreme lengths never to mention it at all. Okay. So the irony is that it wasn't in public discussion in the Black community either. And Tulsa's flagship African-American newspaper, the Oklahoma Eagle, didn't write about it on anniversaries in the 30s, 40s, 50s. It's not till the late 60s that the first articles came out. And I think it's important to remember that for massacre survivors, just how traumatic these events were. I knew survivors as late as the 1990s who were still suffering from PTSD. There was a survivor in the 1970s who still kept a loaded rifle by his front door, quote, in case it should happen again. So as with Holocaust survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre often didn't want to, relive the trauma, but also they didn't want to burden their children and grandchildren with these stories. So they didn't talk about it. So, that was all a part of the mix. So you had entire generations of Tulsans post-massacre who grew up never hearing about this thing. So, so when my first book had come out in 1982, and wasn't reviewed in the Tulsa newspapers, survivors threw a book party for me in Greenwood and whatnot, but it started to help the Death in the Promised Land. It started to help break the ice. But the event that that helped us break through with the story was in 1995 when the Murrah Federal Building was bombed in Oklahoma City. Yeah. If you all will remember, this is pre 9/11. This was, the largest, terrorist incident in American history. So what happened was that the Today Show flew its crew from New York to broadcast live from Oklahoma City during that week. And the host of the Today Show was Bryant Gumbel, the first African-American national network news host. During that week, an African-American former journalist from Tulsa, Don Ross. He'd written the first stories about the massacre for the Oklahoma Eagle in the 1960s. He was now a state representative representing Greenwood in the state legislature. Don Ross met Brian Gumbel and said, as horrible as this event is, there's another story. It's never been told. And he gave Don Ross gave Brian Gumbel a copy of my book, Death in the Promised Land. So 10 days later, Don and I each get phone calls from a producer in New York City for the Today Show who says, on the 75th anniversary of the massacre, we're going to do a story about it. And that was a gigantic breakthrough because the only national news story about the massacre since the 20s had been an op-ed in the Washington Post in '82 when my book came out. So that was a huge breakthrough. So, and I'll get to your point, but so that starts to build, efforts, black and white efforts merge to create a Black Wall Street Memorial. There's going to be an event and all that. The Today Show interviews a number of survivors. They interview me. The story's put in the can a month ahead of time or so. And about 2 weeks beforehand, I thought, well, hell, if the Today Show's doing a story, I can use that to leverage other people. So I got on the phone, and in a week, I got the New York Times, the Washington Post, Associated Press, I think UPI was still in business, and NPR all to do stories. Okay. Yeah. So then on the 75th anniversary, we had this burst of attention. And most of the stories, and it was, front page of the Washington Post, above the crease, 3/4 page story in the New York Times, all that. And most of them were kind of naive. Well, finally, the story is out and we have closure on this and whatnot, but they were good. But the brilliance was Don Ross, this Black legislator, who then took those stories, went to the Republican governor and legislature and said, look, we've never had an official study of what's going on. And he got the legislature and governor to create the Tulsa Race Riot Commission. But his goal was not to have a study. His goal was to win reparations for massacre survivors. He knew how to count votes. He had a thumb on the scale of who the commissioners were, and he got a majority vote in favor of that. So then, meanwhile, they need a historian, and not surprisingly, they asked me. They also asked John O. Franklin, the dean of African American historians, who was from Tulsa. He was very busy, but played very important roles. And so, I get hired. I'm not on the commission, but I'm the historian for the commission. And I was trying to figure out what to do that would be a contribution to what we knew about the massacre. I didn't think we were going to find a lot of new records because I had gone searching. We did find some. So that's how the mass graves came about. And when that story finally broke, it broke internationally about what went on. So that was the next breakthrough. And it was very shocking for a lot of people. It was very shocking for many white Tulsans and white Oklahomans who had grown up in the city and they never knew anything about this event at all. So that was our breakthrough, and that that helped to get us going. Then obviously you came the vote. The commission voted in favor of reparations, paying some form of monetary restitution. At that point, we had roughly 150 massacre survivors, and neither the governor or the state legislature would pay them a penny. Instead, they gave all the survivors a gold-plated medal.
So so thank you again for that context. In light of the disturbing nature of this event, I'm just curious to hear how did they rationalize that response or lack of response in as far as that is to say, with the commission having decided, the commission appointed by the legislature,
right,
having decided that reparations were justified, right, for the survivors who numbered in the triple digits at that point. What exactly was the argument for doing nothing?
Well, I think there's a couple things that play a role into this. I mean, first of all, I think it's very important to remember that that the state of Oklahoma was Indian territory for a long time. This was the end destination of the Trail of Tears, of Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, Cherokee, Creek, all coming to Oklahoma. So Oklahoma has one of the highest percentages of individuals with Native American ancestry. So automatically, when the idea of reparations came up, you heard from a lot of people who said, well, I'm part Choctaw, I'm part Creek, whatever it is. Let's begin with me with giving my land back. So when is that going to happen? So that, and that's something not to be dismissed politically in Oklahoma. But there was simply, no impetus amongst the majority of the state's, white politicians to do anything. It was like, this is a long time ago. Nobody's still alive, who was responsible for this. And we're simply not going to do anything. I think that there is, however, a sidelight to this too, which is the people who were supportive of reparations in Tulsa were not people who were trained politicians. They were not trained people to run campaigns. Remember, there had been a successful reparations campaign in the country a decade earlier in the 80s, with Japanese Americans. Yes. And I think the fact that Japanese Americans were paid reparations was a huge event, and it also said something about the sophistication of the campaign. Granted that we're talking about paying to Asian Americans, not to Black people, and there is a big difference. That being said, the people on that campaign, they focused on two things and two things only. They focused on, number one, the patriotism of Japanese American soldiers during World War II. The most decorated military unit in the American military during the war was an all Japanese, I can't remember, the 415th Regimental Battalion, all Japanese infantry unit who all came from men who had been in the internment camps, who fought their way up the boot of Italy and got more, medals than anyone else. There was a focus on that. The United States is a very patriotic country. That was something not to be dismissed. The second thing they focused on was entirely on the experience of women and children in the camps and how hard it was for mothers to raise their children, to explain the country, the things that children had to, endure out in the plains of Wyoming or in Eastern California in these barren camps. And we're also a family-oriented country. And so they touched two heartstrings and got it. The early efforts in Oklahoma were, well, this isn't such a big deal. Look at the millions that have been paid to Holocaust victims and whatnot. Why can't you do this? A lot of anger. I think there wasn't a focus on the survivors, which should have happened. But that was turned down. That was followed by Professor Charles Ogletree of Harvard, who had a reparations lawsuit that the survivors backed completely 100%. And they just couldn't get over the statute of limitations. That was ultimately the issue. The case made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, but it was the court wouldn't listen to it. Hear it. There is now a new reparations lawsuit in Tulsa that has a unique way of trying to get over the statute of limitations. We'll have to see what happens.
Fair enough. So I know we had about 5 more minutes or so before we get to.
Sorry about these long answers.
I am not,
Vincent,
no.
But there's a lot of layers here.
You're providing context and a great service for all of us who are participating. So I didn't try to cut you off, and that was not by accident. I'm trying to think about how, in the time we have left before we open it up a little bit to the Q&A. I guess the question maybe that comes to mind, there's so many elements here to pursue, but I guess the one I'll pursue is, given the extraordinary level of violence that unfolded, obviously in Tulsa, but as you said at the outset, Scott, given your brilliant context, historical context, lynching and lynching is a kind of an antiseptic term, because of course these were also castrations and public human burnings that unfolded during this time in the 20th century. And Tulsa is a horrific episode that you laid out in some detail. In light of the violence that unfolded in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, in the run-up to the certification of Joe Biden's presidential victory, I guess I have to wonder, do you think this sort of thing could happen again? And if not, I mean, why not? how are Americans different now so that these sorts of things would no longer happen? Or if you think that it could happen again, why and under what circumstances?
Well, I think if something like this happens again, it'll be of a different nature. There's no question. But I mean, the sad reality is the potential for racial violence is there in the United States as it is everywhere else in the world, and we don't have to look very deep in global news and the New York Times or Google News to see that going on. So we are we are still a deeply divided nation racially. To say that there hasn't been progress in your lifetime or my lifetime is ridiculous, and of course there have. But by all of the markers of of how people live their lives and what sort of opportunity are there, we are still a nation that's poisoned by racism. Right at the moment, and I talk about this in the new book. We live in what I call the age of reevaluation, where we're trying to see if we can come to terms with our history. The reality is that, in simple terms, for average families, Black Americans and white Americans, quote, remember history different. They've been taught it differently, not only in schools, but also in their family context. If you ask a white family about the 1950s, well, we'll think of sock hops and Elvis Presley and hoop skirts and the silent generation and I Like Ike. If you talk to an African American family, first thing you might think of is Emmett Till. So the reality though is we just have one history, and we have to do a better job of teaching it. And I think if we can, as a country, can get on the same page as to what our history is, and we don't have to be afraid of it. And there's many wonderful contributions that the United States and the American people have made to the world, and we are right to celebrate them, and we're right to teach them. But we have to teach our shortcomings as well too. And we need to do a better job of that. And if we can start to see our history with similar, lenses, then I think we can start to see the present and the future in a better way as well.
Are you optimistic that is a viable possibility, and if not in the immediate term, then maybe in the near term?
Well, I think I don't know. I mean, we have this rash of laws that have been passed which are essentially to try and intimidate teachers from talking about things. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. I mean, it's absurd not to teach the Tulsa Race Massacre in Oklahoma. Look, I'm a product of the Oklahoma public schools. I can tell you that Oklahoma school children can handle this. They can handle teaching slavery. They know that they're not being blamed for this. I mean, it's like not teaching 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. I mean, it's absurd. And, we need to get beyond this, certainly.
Yeah, agreed. So I think we're about at the time. Dave, yes, David, did you want to read some of the questions? I haven't had a chance to look at any of the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you. Let me, as a lawyer, I'll change a couple of the words from Mary Claire's question, but and also pivot on some of the things you were talking about. But both of you, what was the proximate cause of all the increased attention now? Scott, it was, I think it was Don Ross, and you're reaching out beyond Brian Gumbel to AP, UPI, Reuters, The Times, and The Post. And you might want to talk about how Deneen Brown, I think that's her name, got involved with The Post as well. But what do you think the proximate cause is now? I found out about the Tulsa Race Massacre from a Wondery podcast, which is on the recommended page, which is a few years ago, but only a few years ago. My son found out from episode 1 of the HBO version of Watchman, not the Zack Snyder movie, not the comic book, but HBO's version, which I re-saw on HBO Max a few days ago on purpose. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are. That was our first question from the audience.
I'll take a stab, and then I'm interested to see what Vincent says. Well, the work that we did in the late 90s and early 2000s also sort of created a cottage industry of books about the massacre. We went from like 2 books to like 12 books, and that's sort of built. But there's no question that the centennial that we just observed in late May, early June was very important. But I can tell you that there is no question whatsoever that Watchman has had a gigantic effect. After that first episode aired, I heard from people in the UK and Scandinavia and Shanghai and South America. Why haven't I heard about this? This has been particularly effective in bringing the story to young people, but it's really brought the story all over the world. I think that's been absolutely one of the major events. We're sort of poised to see what happens next. I don't know what it'll be. It's a dawning story to tell the story of the Tulsa Race Massacre in the form of a motion picture or a made-for-TV special. Certain things that people want to have, like a hero, people they can identify with. That can be tough. That can be tough to do, and if you're going to tell this story in an honest way. But we've broken through. There's no question. It's not going to get forgotten again. And I can tell you, I can tell you honestly, every step of the way. I was so lucky as a 21-year-old, a 23-year-old, doing this work that eventually became Death in the Promised Land, that I had a set of elderly African-American survivors who took a chance on this white kid from the wrong side of the tracks and opened up to me. Many of them had never done, most of them had never done a single interview. Many of them had not spoken to family members, but they shared their information with me. And it's because of them that we know what happened. It didn't have to be me. It just turned out to be me. But I can't salute them too much. And whenever we've had a breakthrough, I've thought of those folks and other survivors I got to know well in the 1990s and how proud and happy they would be that the story is coming out.
The next question we got was, unless Vince, you have a comment on the first one.
No, I just briefly, I'll say, I think I agree with Scott that the power of, the mass media, be it in the form of television or motion pictures, to kind of bring attention to an issue is really quite powerful. And what happened with Watchmen, and to a lesser degree, Lovecraft, but definitely what happened with Watchmen, it just solidifies my belief that it can just reach a wider audience than oftentimes is the case with very well crafted academic books.
The next question we got was, and I think it resonates, the questioner didn't mention it, but the National Salvation Army, I think, Scott, you talked about this in the groundbreaking and maybe also in Death of a Promised Land, was turned away because the questioner was asked, what about, where was the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the LA Times, national media? I don't know, KDKA wasn't on the air yet, so it wouldn't have been radio, but it's one thing, according to this questioner, for the white Tulsa papers not to do anything about it, but where were the other media sources? Were they?
Well, and they were there. I mean, this was a front page story in the New York Times. It made the Times of London. The Tulsa Race Massacre even made the Times of India. But two things happened. The first thing happened is that the white city fathers realized very quickly they had a PR problem of immense size on their hands. They're trying to get the city to continue to grow, blah, blah, blah. And martial law, burning, destruction, railroad travel, whatnot. And so they announced to the world that white Tulsans were ashamed of what happened and that the white community will rebuild the Greenwood community. That's not what happened at all. Instead, they tried to steal the land where the Black Commercial District had been to build a train station, their new Union Terminal there. Black lawyers and some white lawyers, but Black lawyers, including John F. Franklin's dad, defeated that in court. And but the word had got out that Tulsa was doing this, but the news cycle moved on, moved on in 1921, just like it did, today. I mean, flood in Colorado, earthquake in Iceland, whatever it was, and people went away. Remember, Tulsa was a long ways away from the media centers. It was a story that was over, and it was just a story was not picked up on.
The next question is about reparations. The questioner mentions a reparations bill that was passed by the Evanston City Council. The question is reparations in a larger sense. I never pronounce his name right, and now that he's going to teach at Howard, if I run into him at Whole Foods, I'll apologize. But Ta-Nehisi Coates' article in the Atlantic, The Case for Reparations, was brilliant. And he was the first witness, or maybe the second after Cory Booker, on the first reparations hearing in maybe ever, what was originally John Conyers' bill. I wonder if you could comment about reparations, and if you're familiar with what Evanston, Illinois did, if you think they took a step forward that was significant. And also, there's a comment that was posted in NewYorker.com today about a book on trust and whether it's increasing or decreasing. And the reviewer made the comment that the fact that a country that used to have Black slaves is going to become a majority minority country in a few years is probably leading to the increased tribalism in this country. You talked about, will there be another Tulsa? I think that's, maybe you could sort of talk about all the reparations issue, the Evanston, Illinois thing, if you know about that, and you know, this racial divide, the tribalism.
Sure. Well, I'll go with the first question. I'll give Vincent the second one because he's going to be an expert on some of these things. But I think a couple things to be said about reparations in Oklahoma. First of all, Oklahoma, it needs to be remembered, is the reddest of the red states. So not a single county voted for Obama in either of his elections. Every single county voted for President Trump in both of his elections. Trump won Oklahoma by 35 points. Okay. Now, this is, that needs to be in context. It is important to remember that it's a Republican, mayor, though, who, has supported, and I have no criticism at all for the way he supported our search for the graves. And we've gotten everything we needed from the city, including the money to do it. But I think that that's the reality. Here's the situation about reparations. You don't have to convince African Americans that reparations for the Tulsa Race Massacre or for Jim Crow or slavery is a good idea. There is solid support there. What you have to do is you're going to have to convince a certain percentage of white people that this is something that we have to do. The only way we're going to get reparations in this country is if there's interracial support for it. And I think that's where the battle is right now. And I think it's going to be that battle for a while. Vincent, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think Scott has absolutely succinctly laid out the reality. It has majority, even perhaps supermajority support in the Black community, and more tepid support in other communities of color, and strong opposition in the white community, broadly speaking. Although there's been some movement in the direction, maybe particularly after the George Floyd demonstrations, but it is still grossly unpopular, the idea of reparations, mostly because I'll be succinct as well, it dovetails very nicely with what Scott has been saying throughout our event here about the Tulsa Massacre, in the very impoverished view of history that many Americans have. So the reparations effort is very much reduced to this thing that happened so long ago that what are we still talking about it for? Of course, that's not what people say when it's Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, but I'll leave that aside. The issue is that it's 150 years ago. Why do we need reparations? Whereas the proponents would say, well, actually, it's not just 150 years ago. We only outlawed legal discrimination in this country in 1968. There are plenty of people, myself being one of them, who were alive during that time. And so we don't have to reach back into the distant mists of history to find rationales for it. But that being said, I don't think many Americans, in some cases, both Black and white, think of it that way, that we had legal discrimination in this country in living memory. And with respect to your question or point, David, about what is the kind of increased tribalism in this country, and it's certainly the case that on a partisan dimension, and of course, with respect to race and ethnicity, there's just increased division in this country. And is it possible that it's being exacerbated by the impending demographic shift wherein non-Hispanic whites will become a minority sometime in, say, the next, depending on which demographer you talk to, I guess sometime in the next 25, 30 years or so. Probably that does contribute to it. Definitely the country has shifted even from my own childhood shifted in terms of just the demographic nature of it. I mean, it's already the case that Americans who are, I guess, under 30, maybe even under 18, are majority non-Hispanic white. Excuse me, are not majority non-Hispanic, or majority non-white, I guess I should say. Yeah, getting confused here. But the world is complicated, of course, and I think the simple story that in the near future whites will simply be in the minority and consequently outvoted and such is grossly overstated. Obviously, non-Hispanic white is the reason I got confused a moment ago, is because that particular qualifier is very important, because a significant fraction of Hispanics actually do identify as white as well. And so, and the definition of white has changed throughout the history of this country, where, you know, Jews and Italians and others were excluded from the category at certain points in American history, and then they were included. So it's not at all clear that the world is going to shift all that much. Certainly the fraction of the population that is African American is projected to remain about 13% into the future. And the Asian population, Asian Pacific Island population, is going to increase, but probably from about 4%, 5% to roughly 10%. So the devil is in the details here. I don't think there's going to be as much dramatic change demographically as some people might suggest.
I wonder if the two of you could talk about, and Scott, you do cover this in the book, the murder of Terrence Crutcher. And George Floyd was murdered on Memorial Day weekend, as was the Tulsa Race Massacre on Memorial Day weekend. I think you put the Terrence Crutcher story in your book, Scott, not just because her sister was an advocate for finding out what happened in Tulsa, but because there's a resonance or a symmetry. I'm assuming that maybe if that's not true, then never mind. Wasn't that the line from Saturday Night Live? But if there was a symmetry, maybe you could talk about these murders and in the context of what we know about Tulsa.
Well, I think that, and I do, yes, I do write about the Terrence Crutcher in the new book, The Groundbreaking, and write about that and that great tragedy that happened. But I think your larger point, I think, is very important. The murder of George Floyd has been some sort of a turning point or a moment of inflection in American history. It's when the ways in which we started to talk about our past have changed. How permanent those changes will be, I don't know. But there's no question at all that has had an impact on people being open to the story of what happened in Tulsa and wanting to learn about it. This is kind of more your territory. I'm going to pass off to you. I'm sort of curious. I mean, in Tulsa, in Tulsa, police violence against African Americans was nothing new. I mean, that was, well known in the community for years. And I talk about other incidents in the book. So again, that wasn't new to African Americans, but certainly, since the cell phone has shown up, that has changed everything in terms of white Americans, being able to see these events that before they had never seen.
Yeah, I think I'm actually working on a project in trying to explore this too. Not necessarily specifically why there were mass demonstrations in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing, but how partly why I was so fascinated by Scott's work, his conversation with him this evening. I mean, how do Americans respond to information that runs counter to the somewhat more rosy story we tell ourselves? And this is true in any nation state, of course. They craft a mythology that is designed to foster patriotism. This is kind of the nature of being in a nation state. So America is not unique in that regard, but there the discrepancy between what we tell ourselves as Americans and sometimes the less than shiny aspects of our shared history is sometimes quite, the glaring discrepancies are quite large. So maybe when they conflict, as was the case with George Floyd, the 9+ minute video of a man being tortured and murdered on tape while he's handcuffed by 4 police officers as people were shouting that he needs medical attention, that may have just been so gruesome that it was a spark that led to, you know, the largest mass demonstration in the 21st century, or maybe even in American history. So I'm hemming and hawing a bit here because I don't exactly know why things unfolded the way they did, and more broadly, how do Americans respond when confronted with the truth about our racial past? That's partly why I was asking Scott about this earlier in terms of how did people respond. I mean, these horrific events in Tulsa, I mean, there really is no defense for them. Particularly, you know, one of the things that Scott mentioned, and bringing it back to the what we discussed earlier, is how the police officers and I guess the National Guard or the State Guard were complicit in acting with the mob as they went and destroyed Greenwood, thereby making it not just you know, inaction on the part of the authorities, but also just active participation. Government was involved, in short. And so the case, it would seem, for reparations would be all the more compelling precisely because it wasn't just a bunch of unconnected individuals, but they were agents of the state who participated. But I think that this just is an uncomfortable reality for many Americans. It doesn't mean that all that we think of, I think Scott made this point earlier, and it's the right one, doesn't mean that everything that we can shed light on in American history is disturbing. Certainly that's not true. Just recently, Americans, in concert with others, were responsible for creating a vaccine that can help us combat this deadly virus. So it is not the case that all that can be said about America is bad, but it is the case that there is bad in American history that we should not try to, you know, sugarcoat. So that's not really much of an answer. I don't have an answer to why people responded the way they did, for example, to the shooting, excuse me, the killing of George Floyd, or other examples of law enforcement overreach, to put it, you know, euphemistically. I don't have an answer for that.
Let's see, it's about 8 after 8. Please use the Q&A feature for any questions. Scott, I wonder, I didn't hear you so far talk about OU Press's response to when you submitted your manuscript. And when I listened to the audible version of that section of the book a few days ago, after having read it in print originally.
How was, I haven't heard the audible. How was it? How's the reader?
Well, Jill Laporte, Harvard, Ethan Cross at Michigan do their own. Ethan said it took him 5 days and they kept interrupting him. You had an actress or an actor do it. It was fine.
Yeah, well, I'd done the previous 2, I'd done my own, but I was just so overloaded because it takes about a week, and I just didn't have the time.
No, but it was fine. It was very professionally done. It was great. The version available through audible.com is the one that I heard. Let me think. But the short letter from OU Press basically said, we wish you luck as you take your work elsewhere. And that could have been in red capital letters in the letter. And you went to LSU Press. Why do you think, there's a lot of ways they could have done a rejection. We're swamped, we're under budget, but it's a great thing you're doing elsewhere. I mean, I'm wondering, why do you think they did that? And could you discuss that?
So the story is that I finished my manuscript. You know, I rewrote would have been my bachelor's thesis into this Death in a Promised Land manuscript. I had my advisor in graduate school said, you ought to go to New York. I said, this needs to have footnotes. It's just, I need to be able to document all this stuff, and they may not want to do that. And I don't think Oxford or somebody, I was up in their class. I had met an editor at LSU Press, Beverly Jarrett. They were doing a lot of exciting work on race, and they weren't hiding from racial violence. she wanted it, but I felt that it really needed to go to my native state press, who was the great publisher of Oklahoma history. And so I wrote them a query letter. And, as you say, they said, no, we're not, we're not the press for you. And I put it in there not to get back at somebody, but it was just to tell the tenor of the times. I mean, they weren't going to touch anything like that. I mean, that's just all there was to it. When my book came out, again, it wasn't reviewed in either of the Tulsa daily newspapers. It did make, for a few years, it was the most stolen book out of the Tulsa City County library system. Of all the branch libraries, it was stolen too. So once a year, I would just send them a box of books, and they would, replenish it. So there were people who didn't want this story to be told them. I've had, people lie about me and, yell at me. I've never been, the people right before me, I mean, they got death threats, and that didn't happen to me. I was, I wasn't seen as a threat. I'm sure I was just a nobody college kid. But, people did not want to teach this at all and did not want to talk about it. And the editors at OU Press didn't. It wasn't a few years later, they did as part of an ethnic history series, the Irish in Oklahoma, the Czechs in Oklahoma, they did one on blacks in Oklahoma. But, recently they published a beautiful photographic history of the massacre. But, again, you have to remember, this is not New York City or Ann Arbor, or someplace like that. There's a different political standard.
The fact that you mentioned your graduate advisor reminds me that in the chat feature, one of your, did your PhD at Duke, and one of your former students for your Rachel set basketball class, Rachel Sal, said to come in the chat. So I wonder if you could
Rachel.
Talk. I wonder if you could talk about race in basketball.
Yeah, good question.
Well, sure. So I'll just show it to you since my publishers would love this. So 5 years ago, I published a book called The Secret Game. And I had been a basketball fan all my life. I discovered that in North Carolina in 1944, during the height of segregation, there was a clandestine, essentially illegal, integrated college basketball game between a black college team, varsity, and a white wartime college team, held in a locked gym on a Sunday morning. And I realized I was dazzled when I discovered the story and tracked it down, but I also realized that the book is really about how societies change, but it's also a book about that there was a forgotten generation that preceded the civil rights generation of Southerners, vastly majority African-American, but some white allies as well, who fought their own undeclared war against segregation at great risk. And I wanted to write a story for them. It too has all the notes. I have to tell you though, I've never written for other scholars. I mean, I have a PhD and all that, but I've always written for a general public. And so I try to write stories that, my Aunt Connie, who was a high school graduate, but nothing beyond that, could read. When I was at the Smithsonian, I learned that the American public is really interested in our history. It's just incumbent upon us to write it in a way that's accessible to them. So that's what I've tried to do.
Before I say my good nights, and Carlos from AAUM puts up a couple closing slides, Scott and Vince, what would you like to leave us with?
Well, I'll dig in just to say how, I've taught now at the U of M for 14 years. I've done a lot of work with the Alumni Association. I've been a speaker at Camp Michigania for 9 years or so. I've done helped to lead some of the True Blue travel trips for the U of M. I love the university. I'm zooming with you from my office in Haven Hall. There's the Diag there. There's the library. It is, I believe, the U of M library is absolutely the greatest library for a writer in the world. It's if they don't have it, they'll get it to you. They'll get it for you. You know, and I'm just, you know, I'm a Reed College graduate. I'm a Duke Blue Devil, although both my parents were Big Ten grads. And I'm really honored to be at this great university and, you know, have been really, really appreciative of the ability to do the work that I've done. I've published 3 books in the last 6 years, and I'm getting ready to work on a new one. So thanks so much for having me tonight. And, you know, again, Washington, D.C. is a very dear place to me. And finally, and I'll shut up, I'm just so honored that Vincent, that you agreed to do this. You're just a spectacular interviewer, and just thank you so much.
Oh, that's very nice of you, Scott. I'll be brief as well here, David. First of all, thank you for this opportunity. Thanks to Scott for just pursuing this story, doing all the great work beyond just the writing of the, you know, groundbreaking books, but working with the commission, et cetera, doing, frankly, Herculean efforts to get justice for the victims of this, you know, tragic event. And I'll also just say I've been at Michigan my entire career, which is a long time. And I am very happy to be here. I've done, as David was, I think, joking with me before the camera went on about how I've done a number of these events for the Alumni Association, and I'm very happy to do so. You know, in my experience, participants have been very receptive to the message that I and my fellow panelists have tried to convey, and working with the undergraduates, the graduate students here, and maintaining connections with you know, alumni has really been the kind of the crowning achievement of my career. It's a fantastic group of folks who come through this university, and I'm just so happy to be associated with it.
And thank you, David, for the terrific job of organizing this. You've just really been fantastic.
Carlos gets a lot of credit too.
Carlos
he can put up the
Yes.
recommendation slides now. Okay. I will be sending everyone that registered, whether they joined us here this evening or not, all the slides, which includes these recommendations. Scott's most recent book is on top. The breathtaking, the iconic book that OU Press would not publish, but LSU Press did, fortunately, is the second one. There's at least one other major book that I listed. There's a lot of them. Deneen L. Brown from the Washington Post has been covering this story for years. This is her May 30th, 2021 story. The podcast that was associated with the History Channel's documentary that Scott was featured in is listed. The one where I first heard, 2019, so it wasn't that long ago when I first heard about the massacre either. I didn't learn about it in the 70s at Michigan, as I mentioned before the podcast, because Scott's book hadn't come out yet. And then, of course, HBO's Watchman, the TV version, especially episode 1, as Scott indicated. The first scene in episode 1 and some other aspects of that episode as well. On behalf of UMDC, I'd like to thank Scott and Vince for this important conversation. This event will be can be viewed again on the YouTube channel.